Savannah, Georgia, 1856. The carpenter's shed smelled of pine tar, sweat, and damp rope. Its walls were lined with timber warped by salt air, its roof scarred by years of storms rolling in from the Atlantic. Inside, a man bent over the grain of a half-finished chair, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who had spent his life shaping wood into usefulness. His name was Nathaniel Brooks. He had lived in bondage for more than 30 years. The overseers called him quiet. The masters called him reliable. To them, he was no more than a tool, flesh that bent without breaking, hands that never trembled when guided by command. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were clipped short, as if sound itself was a luxury he could not afford. But silence is not emptiness. Beneath his lowered eyes and calloused palms, Nathaniel carried a secret, hidden deeper than scars. It was not a secret rebellion, not yet. It was love. His heart belonged to Jonathan Reed, a field hand marked by the land itself. Jonathan's back bore the raised lines of lashes, a history carved into skin. But his walk never lost its rhythm. He was taller than most, his face cut sharp by years of labor, his voice rare but steady. His presence in the quarters was like a lantern in a cave, small, flickering, but impossible to ignore. Their love did not grow in daylight. It took root in shadows, in the narrow hours when the overseers slept and the air was heavy with the weight of unsung songs. A hand brushed against another when passing buckets of water. A shoulder lingered against a shoulder in the smokehouse doorway. A glance stolen while the hymn dragged on in the chapel. Words of salvation echoing hollow against chains. They spoke little, but they did not need to. Silence between them became a language. On nights when the moon hung swollen and pale, Nathaniel would slip from his shed and find Jonathan waiting near the edge of quarters. They would sit against the same tree trunk, not touching, not daring to move closer than shadows permitted. And yet in those moments the world bent differently. The field seemed less endless. The sky seemed wider. I remembered, Jonathan once said, his voice low, a statement more than confession. Nathaniel did not ask what he remembered. He knew memory for them was not a luxury. It was inheritance. Sometimes they dreamed aloud, though their dreams were made fragile by the chains that bound them. Jonathan spoke of rivers beyond the swamps, rivers that led north, where the air was colder and men did not bow to overseers. Nathaniel spoke less, but when he did, his voice trembled with the weight of longing. "Sky," he whispered once. "I want the sky." Together, they watched it. The indifferent stars, the moon that waxed and waned without permission. To dream of the sky was dangerous, but it was also survival. In the daylight, they returned to roles etched into their flesh. Nathaniel carved chairs for master's parlor, mended fences, patched floorboards that groaned under wealth. Jonathan bent over cane stalks that sliced skin open like paper, hauled loads heavier than any man should bear. And when the overseer's whip cracked, Jonathan did not cry out. He bit down on silence, because silence was the only shield left. To others, they were shadows among shadows. To each other, they were everything. But the South has never been kind to secrets. Walls whisper, eyes wander. The quarters themselves seem to breathe with suspicion. And in Savannah, where every step was watched and every whisper measured, love was more dangerous than knives, more forbidden than flight. Still, Nathaniel carried it like a hidden brand. Jonathan carried it like a buried flame. Together, they dreamed of the sky, even while chained to the earth. Savannah, Georgia, 1856, the yard. The day began with heat that pressed like iron, and by noon the air itself seemed to burn. The field shimmered under the sun, rows of cane bending in silence. The overseers shouted, the whips cracked, but somewhere deeper, something older stirred, a silence so thick that even cicadas faltered. It was on that day Colonel Edgar Hartford discovered what should have remained hidden. Hartford was a man who believed cruelty was proof of power. His house stood high on the bluff above the river, painted white, its windows reflecting the sun like glass knives. Inside, silver gleamed, portraits watched with dead eyes, and rugs muffled the footsteps of wealth built on the breaking of bodies. Outside, his field stretched in every direction, stitched together by sweat, watered by blood. He liked to stand on the veranda with a glass of rum and remind his guests, this is order. This is God's will. That afternoon, order broke. No one knows exactly how Hartford found them, Nathaniel and Jonathan. Some say it was the whispers of jealous eyes in the quarters. Others say the overseer saw their hands brush when passing water. But whatever the cause, suspicion grew into certainty, and certainty into spectacle. Hartford was not a man to kill quietly. He wanted witnesses. The horn was blown. Slaves were driven into the yard, their chains clinking like broken hymns. The overseers herded them in a circle, rough hands shoving, eyes sharp for hesitation. Children were dragged by their mothers, too young to understand why the air suddenly smelled of fear. Nathaniel was pulled from the carpenter's shed, his arms bound tight behind his back with rawhide that cut into his wrists. Jonathan was brought from the fields, his shirt already torn, his body marked with sweat and dust. Their eyes met only once in that chaos, a glance swift as lightning, but enough. Neither spoke. They had no words left to give. Hartford descended from the veranda like a priest approaching an altar. His boots struck the earth heavy, measured. He carried no whip in his hand, no rope. He didn't need them. Power itself seemed to follow him like shadow. He announced it plainly, his voice loud enough to carry across the yard. This house is not a place for love, he said, his eyes sharp as glass. Not that kind. Not between beasts who forget their place. The yard went still. The only sound was the breath of 100 bodies caught between fear and fury. Hartford gestured, and the overseers moved. Jonathan was forced to his knees. 2 men held his arms. Another pressed his head down. A whip was uncoiled, let alone his memory, the kind soaked in brine to cut deeper. The first strike tore across Jonathan's back, with a sound like fire splitting wood. The flesh opened, blood blooming bright in the sun. He didn't cry out. His teeth clenched, his eyes fixed on the earth. The second strike came harder, lifting him off his knees. The third carved across scars that had never healed. With each blow, Hartford's voice rose above the cracks. This is order. This is law. This is the price of forgetting your place. By the 10th lash, Jonathan's breath came ragged. Each exhale a struggle. His body swayed but did not fall. His silence was louder than any scream. Nathaniel stood bound, forced to watch. His face was carved from stone, but inside his heart split open. Every strike landed not just on Jonathan's flesh, but on Nathaniel's own chest. He could not look away. He would not. After the lashes came the final cruelty. Hartford raised his hand, and the overseers dragged Jonathan upright, blood running down his back in rivers. The colonel's voice cut sharp. Mercy is wasted here. Let him be an example. The noose was brought, a rope thick as a wrist, looped with the ease of practice. The nearest oak tree had held more than fruit. Its branches bore scars of rope burns. Its roots fed on bodies buried without markers. They placed the rope around Jonathan's neck. His chest rose once, slow, deliberate, as if he were gathering the last of his strength not for himself, but for the man who watched. His eyes sought Nathaniel's, not fear, not regret. Only fire, only defiance. And then the rope pulled. His body lifted, suspended against the sky he had once dreamed of. His legs kicked, his hands clawed at air, his face contorted. But still he did not scream. Silence followed him into death. Silence heavier than any hymn. The yard broke into whispers, mothers pressing children's faces against their skirts, men bowing their heads, women biting their lips until they bled. No one dared to move, but everyone saw, everyone remembered. When Jonathan's body stilled, swaying in the hot wind, Hartford turned. His face was calm, almost satisfied. "Let this be known," he said coldly. "There is no love here but the master's will." Then he looked at Nathaniel, bound, unmoving, eyes burning but face unreadable. Hartford's lips curled faintly. "And let this one learn what it means to be left alive." The overseers dragged Nathaniel back to the shed. They did not whip him, did not hang him. They left him bound, left him to watch the shadow of Jonathan's body, swinging against the sun until day fell into night. Inside him, something shifted. Grief did not soften him. It hardened. He did not cry. He did not beg. He carved the memory of that moment deep into his bones, as permanent as the scars on his wrists. That day, Nathaniel Brooks ceased to be only a carpenter. He became an oath that one day, the blood spilled in the yard would not go unanswered. Savannah, Georgia, winter of 1856. 3 nights had passed since Jonathan Reed's body swung from the oak tree in the yard. The rope burn still scarred the branch, and beneath the roots, the earth was darker than before, fed with blood it had not asked for. In the quarters, no one spoke Jonathan's name aloud. To do so was dangerous, but silence was not forgetfulness. The silence hummed with memory, with grief turned into a current that passed between eyes and hearts without sound. Nathaniel Brooks did not kneel to pray. He had knelt enough in his life, and prayers had never been answered here. Instead, he carved. His hands, bound in blistered days before, moved with an obsession that did not resemble his usual work. The carpenter's shed still smelled of pine tar and sawdust, but its benches no longer bore chairs or tables. Now they held scraps of bone and would shave thin as breath. Pieces cut sharp, honed again and again until the line between tool and weapon blurred. He worked at night, when the overseers believed him too broken to rise, when the other men in the quarters sank into uneasy sleep. He rose in silence, feet bare against the dirt, and returned to the shed where shadows covered him like a second skin. He carved by candlelight, so weak it seemed more smoke than flame. The sound was not the rhythm of labor anymore, but preparation. Scrape, cut, sharpen, test. The first thing he made was small, a bird shaped crudely from wood, its wings angled as if in flight. It was not meant to last. He pressed the figure into his palm until the edges cut into skin, until blood smeared across the grain. He left it on the bench, unfinished, a remembrance not of beauty, but of Jonathan. Then he turned to bone. He found fragments near the smokehouse, where scraps of slaughtered hogs were discarded. Bone did not bend like wood. It cracked, resisted, demanded patience. He split with care, carving it down to a jagged edge. By the second night, his hands were covered in cuts, not from overseers, but from his own making. He welcomed the sting. Pain was no longer punishment. It was proof. By day, Nathaniel watched. He became a shadow at the edge of the big house, his silence now a weapon. He noted when Colonel Hartford left the riverfront, when he returned, which rooms he favored, how many times he filled his glass with rum before laughter overtook him. He memorized the sound of keys rattling on the overseer's belt, the creak of floorboards in the hallway outside the study, the hinge of the back door that whined like a wounded animal if opened too quickly. He noticed more than the master's habits. He saw the patterns of merchants who visited. Men dressed in coats too fine for the heat, their pockets swollen with contracts, their tongues fat with rum. He saw the way Hartford preened before them, boasting of crops and obedience, reminding them of his power in the same way he had reminded the yard when Jonathan was hanged. Every boast, every drink, every step became part of a map Nathaniel folded into his mind. At night he carved still. The blade of wood and bone grew sharper, smoother, wrapped in rags to muffle its gleam. He tested its point on his palm until droplets of blood dotted the dirt floor beneath him. He whispered once, voice hoarse with the weight of silence. Not for fleeing. He was not preparing to run. He was preparing to return. The quarters began to sense it. Though Nathaniel spoke to no one, though he carried his grief like stone, his eyes had changed. He no longer looked down when overseers passed. He no longer bowed his shoulders under weight. In his gaze, something older stirred, a memory not only of Jonathan, but of all who had been broken here. An old woman named Leah, bent with years and lashes, caught his eye one evening as he left shed. She said nothing, only pressed her palm against her chest, as if to say, "We see." That night he dreamed. The dream was not of escape, nor of peace. It was of Jonathan standing beneath the oak tree, eyes bright even as the rope cut deep. In the dream, Jonathan did not speak. He only looked at Nathaniel until the silence itself said, "Remember." Nathaniel woke before dawn, sweat cold on his neck, the unfinished blade heavy in his hand. He did not sleep again. On the 4th night, he lit no candle. He carved in darkness, letting his hands remember the grain by touch alone. Each movement was measured, patient, steady as if the blade itself demanded silence. When at last he stopped, he held in his hand something not born for woodwork or play. It was simple, crude, but sharp enough to open flesh, sharp enough to end breath. He wrapped it in cloth and placed it beneath the floorboard of his shed. The next morning, Hartford strutted across the yard with merchants at his side, their laughter carrying above the fields. The sound was sharp, brittle, hollow. Nathaniel watched from the distance, the brand of grief burning in his chest, his oath sharpening in silence. He would not kneel. He would not pray. He would carve, and when the time came, he would strike. Savannah, Georgia, the riverfront, January 1857. The Ogeechee River was swollen that winter, its dark waters carrying driftwood and secrets downstream. Along its banks, the Hartford house glowed with lanterns, a beacon of pride and wealth raised high against the swamp. Its wide veranda hosted laughter that night, the kind that comes after too much rum, too much roasted meat, too much certainty that power was eternal. Inside, merchants crowded the great room. Their coats smelled of tobacco and spice, their fingers heavy with rings that caught candlelight like small suns. They toasted Edgar Hartford, their host, their ally, the man who had shown them fields fat with cane and slaves who bent without breaking. They admired his house, his silver, his wife's piano, the paintings of ancestors who stared down from gilded frames as if approving of the arrogance below. The sound of boots, laughter, and clinking glasses drowned out everything. But beneath that noise, in the shadows of the hall, another rhythm moved. Nathaniel Brooks had entered the house. He did not come to the front. He slipped into the servants' corridor, silent as breath, the blade of wood and bone wrapped in cloth against his chest. His eyes, once dulled by grief, burned with a steady fire now. He was not drunk, not laughing, not boasting. He was memory made flesh. The first door he opened was the pantry. Empty. He moved past it, down the narrow hall toward the study, the master's sanctuary. The brass doorknob was warm from the fire within. He turned it slowly, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him. The study smelled of rum, tobacco, and leather-bound ledgers. Papers lay scattered across the desk, records of shipments, debts, names of men and women priced like livestock. On the wall hung a portrait of Hartford's father, eyes cold, mouth curved in a smile that was nothing but hunger preserved in paint. Nathaniel set the blade on the desk. His hands did not tremble. He did not sit. He stood in silence, waiting. Outside, laughter swelled. Boots echoed closer. Then the doorknob rattled. Hartford entered, his face flushed with drink, his chest swollen with pride. He stopped when he saw Nathaniel. For a moment, the world narrowed to two men in one room. "What are you doing here?" Hartford's voice was thick with disbelief, but beneath it, a flicker of unease. Nathaniel said nothing. He lifted the blade from the desk. The firelight caught its edge, crude but sharp, a creation born not of craft but of grief. Hartford sneered. "You think you can frighten me? You're nothing. A tool. A beast." Still Nathaniel did not speak. He stepped forward. The struggle that followed was brief but brutal. Hartford lunged, grabbing for Nathaniel's arm, but the carpenter moved with a strength born of fury. The blade flashed. Blood spilled across the desk, soaking contracts, staining ledgers. Hartford's roar filled the room, muffled quickly by Nathaniel's hand pressed hard against his mouth. The merchants outside heard the noise. They rushed to the door, pounding, shouting. The lock held. Nathaniel had barred it with the iron bolt. Inside, Hartford fell to his knees, his hands clutching his ruined body. He was not dead. Not yet. But he was stripped. Nathaniel leaned close, his voice finally breaking the silence that had held him for 30 years. Not as property. As a man. The word struck harder than the blade. Hartford's eyes widened, rage mixing with a fear he had never known. His breath came ragged, his body broken, his power spilled onto the floor. The pounding on the door grew louder. The merchants shouted, demanding it be opened. Nathaniel turned once, looked at the window overlooking the river, and made his choice. He left Hartford bleeding in his own study, alive but ruined, the man who had worshipped power now staring at its absence. With a single strike, Nathaniel shattered the window latch. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of water and mud. He leapt into the night, vanishing toward the swamp. Chaos erupted behind him. The merchants burst through the door, finding Hartford collapsed against the desk, his silver buttons soaked red, his ledgers ruined. They cried for doctors, for guards, for vengeance. But Nathaniel was already gone. He did not vanish alone. 3 others slipped into the night with him, men who had waited years for a chance at freedom. Together they ran through cane fields silvered by moonlight, their breaths ragged, their feet pounding earth that suddenly felt less heavy. Behind them, dogs barked, horns blew, overseers shouted. But the swamp opened wide, swallowing them whole. That night, fire seemed to follow Nathaniel, not from torches, but from memory. Jonathan's face burned before him, not in death, but in life, the way he had looked when their hands brushed in the dark. Every step into the swamp was a step away from chains, a step toward vengeance carried into freedom. By dawn, the Hartford state was in uproar. The master lived, but barely. His body never healed straight again. He limped. His voice broke when he shouted. His hands trembled when he tried to lift a glass. His power, once absolute, now hung shattered. And Nathaniel Brooks became something more than a fugitive. He became a name whispered in the quarters, a shadow in the cane, a ghost along the river. He had not fled in fear. He had struck in fire. And fire, once kindled, does not die easily. Savannah, Georgia, 1857, and the years that followed. The ledgers of the Hartford estate recorded it as madness. The newspapers called it savagery. The courts declared Nathaniel Brooks a fugitive, a criminal, a beast who had bitten the hand that fed him. His name was written in ink the color of judgment, added to wanted lists and bounty posters that promised silver for his capture, dead or alive. But the records never carried the truth. In the quarters, where memory traveled not on paper but on whispers, Nathaniel's name was spoken differently, not as a curse, not as a warning, as an answer. The night after he vanished into the swamps, the yard stood silent beneath the oak where Jonathan Reed had swung. Mothers hushed their children. Men stood with arms folded tight. Women pressed cloths to their mouths to stifle cries that wanted to rise. The rope still hung from a branch, frayed at the end, swaying gently in the wind. No one touched it. No one dared cut it down. But every gaze held the same fire they had seen. 2 days later, a wooden bird appeared on Hartford's porch. Small, rough, its wings crooked as if caught in mid-flight. The overseers mocked it, called it a child's toy, and tossed it into the fire. But in the quarters, eyes widened. They knew Nathaniel's hand. They knew what it meant. I remember, I am not gone. The next year, on the day Jonathan had died, another bird appeared. And the year after, another, always on the same day, always on the same porch. Some said Nathaniel carved them in the swamps, leaving them behind as a message. Others swore they were placed there by unseen hands, carried by spirits. The overseers burned them, cursed them, nailed extra locks to the doors. But the birds kept coming. The Hartford family grew uneasy. The master's limp worsened, his voice cracked with weakness. And at night he woke screaming, insisting he heard the creak of a rope outside his window. He hired new guards, bought new hounds, fortified the estate. But nothing could silence the whispers. They weren't toys, the slaves said softly in the dark. They were wings. Years passed, but Jonathan's name never faded. The oak tree still bore its scar, and the wind to the marsh sometimes carried a sound too much like a man's last breath. Children born after his death learned his story before they learned their own, told in murmurs while fires burned low, told as warning and as promise. And always beside Jonathan's name was Nathaniel's, not as a runaway, not as prey, as the one who had struck back. Some claimed to have seen him in the swamps, a figure moving through cypress and shadow, guiding small groups northward, leading men and women through paths no hound could track. He became less man than myth, a ghost that fed on rumor. The master spoke his name with fear, the slaves with reverence. At times, the stories grew wild. They said he could cross a river without leaving ripples, that he traveled with owls whose wings muffled his steps, that he carried Jonathan's spirit beside him, unseen but never absent. A legend is never exact. It does not need to be. It only needs to breathe. Hartford died 10 years later. his fortune fractured, his sons unable to keep the estate whole. The ledgers rotted, the house leaned. The name that had once commanded fear now spoke only of ruin. But in the quarters, Jonathan and Nathaniel still lived. Not in flesh, but in the marrow of stories passed down like heirlooms. One woman, old Leah, who had once pressed her hand to her chest in silence, would sit by the fire and tell children. He did not flee. He did not bow. He carved what sorrow gave him, and he struck. And when the children asked if Nathaniel ever returned, she would shake her head slowly. He never needed to. He left wings. Generations later, when the war came and shackles cracked, when freedom was declared but not delivered, when names were still buried beneath weight, the story of Nathaniel Brooks and Jonathan Reed remained. Men carried it into fields as they bent to harvest for wages too thin. Women carried it as they washed clothes for masters turned employers. Children carried it as they learned to write the words their ancestors had only whispered. The records may have forgotten. The courts may have erased. But memory has no ledger. Even now, when the marsh winds rise at dusk, the sound carries across Savannah like a hymn half broken, half whole. It is the sound of rope creaking, of wings beating, of two names woven into one breath. Jonathan, Nathaniel, they were never saints, never martyrs carved in marble. They were men who loved, men who suffered, men who chose to resist in a world that offered no mercy. That was enough to make them legend, because memory is stronger than name. And in the end, when all the records are burned, what remains is not the ink of power, but the whispers of the oppressed. Not runaway, not fugitive. Answer,